want to introduce our author. Mills Kelly is a historian of the Appalachian Trail and a professor of history at George Mason University. He first set foot on the Appalachian Trail in 1971. We get to date you there. As a Boy Scout hiking in Shenandoah National Park, and has had a love affair with the trail ever since. He is also the volunteer archivist for the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club in Vienna, which is where he first came into contact with the story of Virginia's lost segment of the Appalachian Trail. His podcast, The Green Tunnel, which we have information on the desk over there, charts the history of the trail from its founding to the present. And he's here today to talk about his book, Virginia's Lost Appalachian Trail. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And my name is Katharine Froehlich. I didn't tell you that. So thank you for coming and joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah. Let's go right to that experience. I just finished, having a Richard Louv presentation and Last Child in the Woods. What happened on that Boy Scout trip in 1971 that kind of hooked you?
I can't remember at all. It was more than 50 years ago. So, but I will say, my scoutmaster in 1971 was from California. He was a World War II veteran and had fought his way across the Pacific. And he took us hiking on this trail in Shenandoah National Park called the Appalachian Trail. But as far as I know, he had no idea that it extended from Georgia to Maine. It was just the trail in Shenandoah National Park that we hiked on. And so it wasn't until 1973 when we had a presentation at one of our scout meetings by someone who had just completed a hike from Georgia to Maine that I learned that it actually was this 2,000 plus mile long trail. And I remember being really amazed, like that trail we hike on goes all the way to Georgia, which is where my family's originally from. And so it was a surprise.
Yeah, that's a surprise. Well, just to get a feel for the room, how many through hikers do we have here? Oh my. How about section hikers? Do we have some section hikers? Look at that. How about no one, you've not put your foot on the Appalachian Trail? Nobody. Awesome. Okay. So this is a great group of hikers, I think. So let's just dive in. What is Virginia's Lost Appalachian Trail area, and how long is that?
So the section of the trail that I call the Lost Appalachian Trail runs from Roanoke all the way down to Damascus, right on the Tennessee border. And of course, the trail runs from Roanoke to Damascus now, but in its original incarnation, beginning in 1930, instead of the route that it takes today, if you imagine that you're hiking south from Roanoke and you cross over McAfee Knob, that almost everybody has tried to take a picture of at some point if they've hiked on the trail from there, and when you get to the highway going south, it sort of vectors off to the west a little bit toward Dragon's Tooth. But in 1930, when it hit that road, it took an immediate left turn and went straight south across Poor Mountain into Floyd County and ran along the route that largely is the Blue Ridge Parkway today until it got all the way to the North Carolina border, crossed into North Carolina for all of like 2 miles, and then came back into Virginia through the town of Galax, which a furniture town, and then crossed over the New River just to the little bit to the west of Galax at the town of Fries, and then from there climbed up onto Iron Mountain and followed the Iron Mountain Range all the way down to Damascus. So that's actually 300 miles of trail. And in 1952, then they abandoned that route for the current route. So when they did so, they let go of 15% of the entire trail all at once.
Wow. Does that cause any kind of, for those purists out there, about who is really a through hiker or who did the first through hike? Does it cause problems for that?
Well, yes, in a sense. But, so there, as Mary Katharine says, there are through hikers and then there are purist through hikers. The purist through hiker says you have to walk every single step. You have to pass every single white blaze on every tree and every rock. Otherwise, you're not actually a through hiker. And I will say that the Appalachian Trail Conservancy doesn't look at it this way. Their view is that if you hike the whole trail at some point in your life, whether it takes you 50 years or 5 months, then you are considered a 2,000-mile hiker, not a thru hiker. You don't get a thru hiker patch and a thru hiker certificate. You get a 2,000-miler certificate. So they're not so concerned with the whole purist thing. But the earliest thru hikers did take the route that I describe in the book. And since then, they take the current route. So it's just different routes. The Appalachian Trail changes every single year. Yeah, it changes every year because, there's a landslide and they have to route the trail in a slightly different direction to get around all those rocks. Or one of the local trail clubs or the ATC acquires a new piece of land with better views. And so they run the trail up and over that mountain. Or, for a whole variety of reasons, it moves around. And so the trail that somebody hiked this year is very different from the trail that somebody hiked last year, which is different from the one the year before. My book is just about a huge change in the trail.
So, and I love your book, how deeply you go into the history of the Appalachian Trail. If we could talk a little bit about the original designer of the Appalachian Trail who submitted, was it Benton?
Yeah, Benton Mackay.
Yeah, 1921. How does his original vision differ from really what it's evolved into today?
So, Mackay was a really interesting guy, and he was a socialist, a Harvard socialist, which meant that he didn't spend a lot of time with working class people. The workers were more sort of a theoretical construct for him. But he was very concerned. In 1921, he was very concerned about the health of workers in the United States. And because first of all, industrial labor was incredibly dangerous and unhealthy. Second, there'd been the First World War and then the influenza pandemic. And so by 1921, a lot of people had died. And so Mackay was a big believer in the sort of the healing nature or the healing properties of nature, and that it would be good for people, especially working class people, to have the opportunity to go spend a few hours or a few days hiking in the mountains. And he wasn't wrong about that. It is really good for you to do that. So this explains why the Appalachian Trail runs so close to all the big cities of the East Coast, was because Mackay wanted it to be a trail that would be accessible to working class people. And so, so here, it runs right along the mountain just east of us. And that's because you could take the train from Washington to Winchester or to Front Royal or, various places along the mountain range. And what Mackay didn't understand was that working class people on their day off didn't really want to go to the mountains. They wanted to go to a baseball game or hang out with their family or just sleep. And so, because it was really hard being an industrial worker in 1921. So, but the idea really caught on. And because there were trail clubs all over the East Coast that were sort of waiting for something like this to be proposed. And when it was, they jumped on it and said, what a fabulous idea. And so, but Mackay was not the person to organize anything like that. He was, to be honest, a little bit of a flake. And so he had great ideas, but he had no ability to carry them through. And so instead, a group of people met in Washington in 1925 and formed what then they called the Appalachian Trail Conference, now the Conservancy, and to bring this project to reality. And it took another 12 years to finish the trail. It wasn't until 1937 that they finally wrapped it up.
I love the pictures on the front of this book too, and just the going into the details of how to construct a trail and why this fellow, I think, was one down in Southwest Virginia. Why was it so difficult, or was it from the north to the south, and especially Southwest Virginia?
So when they started building the Appalachian Trail, a lot of it was really pretty easy because there were already trails. The Appalachian Mountain Club had an extensive network of trails in New England. There were trail clubs forming in various places like the Great Smoky Mountains and in Georgia. But and the Appalachian Trail Project has always depended on volunteer labor. The various trail clubs are the ones who made the trail, and they've maintained the trail ever since. It's this really It's this thing that the National Park Service did in 1968 that, to my knowledge, they've never done since. And that is that when the Appalachian Trail became a national park, they delegated the authority over the taking care of that park to all these volunteer clubs. Normally, the National Park Service is a little more controlling, but right now there are 33 clubs that take care of the trail. But Southwest Virginia was really a problem because it's a very unpopulated part of the state. Galax was the only town of any size that had maybe, 1,200 people in it in 1930. And so it was really challenging to get the trail clubs organized in that part of the state. And this guy on the cover, Shirley Cole, was the county agent in Floyd County. And in 1929, he writes a letter to the chairman of the ATC, a guy named Myron Avery, and says, hey, I figured out the solution for getting the trail from Roanoke to Damascus, and here's where I think it should go. And Myron Avery, who it would be polite to call him a control freak because he was way worse than that. He had kind of a freak out about it and really did not want somebody in Southwest Virginia deciding where the Appalachian Trail should go. So he sent his own people to try to scout it out.
He's from D.C., right?
He was he lived in D.C., but he was from Maine, but he was a government attorney in D.C.
Okay, so what was it when he sent the scout? What was it about this section that really, these were people who had, I imagine they had been on trails all over, and they were impressed by what they found in Southwest Virginia.
Yeah, so the person he sent was somebody who had scouted the route of the trail in Georgia, a guy named Roy Osmer. And Osmer was a forester with the Georgia State Forest Service. And apparently in 1930, if you worked for the Georgia Forest Service, you could just take off like 5 or 6 weeks to go scout a trail, no problem. And so Osmer came up from Georgia to Lynchburg, and he went to the Peaks of Otter, which is as far south as the trail had gotten in Virginia. And so from the Peaks of Otter Lodge, he then started trying to work his way south, and he immediately got lost. Because if you've driven that section of the Blue Ridge Parkway, you may notice that you cross over one stream after another. There are all these water gaps along the great escarpment of Virginia where the land sort of rises up from the Piedmont up onto that plateau. And Osmer, who was an experienced trail scout, he just got lost. And so he did the thing he wasn't supposed to do. He got in touch with this guy, Shirley Cole, and who Avery was trying to like screen out of the whole process, and said, hey, can you like help me out a little bit? And Cole said, I'd love to do that. And so he and Osmer scouted out the route and essentially just followed what Cole had proposed in the first place. And then Osmer writes this like 11-page single-space memo back to Myron Avery in which he says, I have solved the problem of Southwest Virginia. And he lays it all out in detail. And then in the very last couple of sentences, he says, and Mr. Shirley Cole was extraordinarily helpful to me in this process. And Myron Avery, being Myron Avery, then immediately took full credit and wrote to his boss and said, we have solved the problem of Southwest Virginia. So that's how it happened.
Now, in your work on this book, you interviewed his daughter. Is that right? 101?
I did. I interviewed Dorothy Shiflett, who is Shirley Cole's daughter. I haven't been in touch with her in a couple of years, so I don't know if Dorothy's still with us. But she was 101 when I talked to her, still driving. Those of you who live in Waynesboro, you might want to just like keep an eye out. You live in Waynesboro, so I somehow feel like 100 should be the limit on driver's license, but. What do I know? I'm only 64. But she was great. She had really strong memories of going out and helping build the trail with her father.
How important was it to the communities there? You said they were small communities. So how important to those communities to have the trail coming through?
You know, it was just really, really critically important to them. If you go to Floyd County today, which I highly recommend. The town of Floyd is a really wonderful place to go. Floyd County, which is a very large county, has one traffic light. So in 2023, and it's right in the middle of downtown Floyd. That is the only place where you have to pause for traffic in the whole county. And so it's still a very rural place. And having the Appalachian Trail come through their communities was a big deal. I mean, not that many people hiked on the trail from 1930 to 1952, but people did. And they came from other places. And there was this wonderful cultural exchange that happened. So the first person to successfully hike the trail southbound in 1 year, a machinist from Connecticut named Chester Jingalewski, he just like showed up in these little country stores in Southwest Virginia to buy supplies with his really thick Connecticut Polish accent. And I'm sure that somebody in, one of these tiny little stores in Southwest Virginia had never met a Polish immigrant from Connecticut, and he had never met people from Southwest Virginia. So they got to have these kinds of great conversations.
What was it like for those early hikers? I know we had a Grandma Gatewood. Ben Montgomery came to maybe 5-6 years ago, and what an amazing story hers was. But what was the trail like for those hikers? Was it easy to get lost?
It was pretty easy to get lost. If you want to, so going northbound, if you started in Damascus and you got up onto Iron Mountain, and hiked along there, that was a really good place to get lost. I mean, as long as you stayed on the ridge top, then you knew you were in generally the right place. But the trail was not especially well marked. It wasn't especially well maintained. And so hikers kind of blundered along, especially after the Second World War, because during the Second World War, there was essentially no maintenance of the Appalachian Trail because we were kind of busy during the Second World War, and so people struggled on that side of the trail, on that side of the New River. On the east side of the New River, it was a lot easier because the trail was mostly on old abandoned roadbeds, and so it was a lot easier to keep track of.
Provisions. I laughed when I came across dynamite. Was it dynamite soup?
Dynamite soup.
And a slab of bacon? I don't know how many hikers today go out with a slab of bacon.
Yeah. For our through hiker, did you happen to carry with you a 3-pound slab of bacon at any point? Right. This was like recommended provisions, right? So, and I have to say, I wonder, this is one of the great things about being a historian, is you get to spend all this time sort of wondering about esoteric things. And as a hiker, I couldn't imagine putting a 3-pound slab of bacon in my backpack. It would just be like a bear magnet, and like, hello, bacon. So, and not to mention the grease that would just spread through your backpack. Well, it turns out that Abercrombie & Fitch, which now is just a mall clothing store, used to be the biggest outdoor supplier in the United States. And they sold something called a pork bag that you put your big chunk of bacon in, and carried it with you. But and dynamite soup was the one that really bedeviled me. I kept seeing references to dynamite soup. So I thought it was like an old brand of soup no longer available in stores. And I couldn't find it anywhere. And I even tried one of my favorite research databases, eBay, because eBay, you find like old soup cans, and stuff like that. So I just couldn't find it. And then one day in the archives of the Smoky Mountain Hiking Club in Knoxville, I found a letter that referred to the recipe for dynamite soup. And I thought, aha, finally, I know. And it turns out there was the Knorr company, Knorr, used to produce something called Erbswurst, which is like split pea sausage, basically. They just stopped making it a few years ago. And so you would cut it up and put it in a pot with some onions and whatever else you had lying around, and you would make basically split pea soup. And as the writer said, it is known as dynamite soup for its post-dining explosive qualities. Which is not the answer you thought I was going to get.
I'm so glad I asked that question, right? It's noon.
But for years I've been wondering, and I just found out it was that. That's why they called it dynamite soup.
Okay, so leaving the dynamite, why did they move that trail?
So the trail moved in 1952 And at the end of the hiking season of 1952, they essentially declared that part of the trail over, null, void, done. And they wrote it out of the hiking guides, so that if you were hiking in 1953 and you were using the current trail guide, you had no way to know that the trail used to go in an entirely different direction in Southwest Virginia. And because you were just following your trail guide. And so the reason they moved it, there were a couple of reasons. One of those was the difficulty of keeping trail clubs together to take care of the trail. Between the Depression and the war and the low population of that part of the state, it was just really challenging. And so like groups of trail maintainers from the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club here in the DC area would twice a year go down there, which is it was challenging in those days. I mean, they had to ride the train to Roanoke and then arrange bus service down into Meadows of Dan, where they would then go out on the trail. And so this was just like not a great way to keep track of or keep the trail maintained. And the Roanoke Club helped out, and they just had a real struggle with that. And so that was the problem. And then the second problem was that on the east side of the river, the trail was mostly on these old abandoned roadbeds as opposed to mountain trail. And then third was an opportunity, which was during the 1930s, the Jefferson National Forest expanded dramatically and in that part of the state. And so all of a sudden, there was a lot of federal land that they could move the trail onto, which would both give it protection from real estate development, and mining and logging and things like that. But also, Forest Service workers would help take care of the trail somewhat. So it was sort of a combination of problems and opportunity that caused them to move the trail in 1952.
And can you just give us, I know we're going to go to questions from you all very shortly, but just like one spot that the modern hiker is missing that is kind of extraordinary. There were so many in your book.
Yeah. So, sorry, I have to do two. So one is the Pinnacles of Dan, which is in the headwaters of the Dan River, or in what's called the Kibler Valley or the Dan River Gorge. And the Pinnacles of Dan, it's really only one pinnacle, so I'm never been quite sure why it's plural, but it's just like a pyramid-shaped mountain down in that gorge, and the trail literally goes up one side and down the other. And hikers who went on the old route said that was the second most difficult part of the entire trail, with Mahoosic Notch in New England being the most difficult, still the most difficult. But the Pinnacles of Dan, they said, was the second most difficult part of the whole trail, but the views were really spectacular. But then I'll also say, if you want to go on the old Appalachian Trail yourself today, the easiest way to do it is drive the Blue Ridge Parkway south from Roanoke. And when you get close to Tuggle's Gap, there's one of the turnouts on the parkway. It's called the Saddle. And pull in there and look at the incredible views out over the Piedmont from there. And then you'll notice right at the edge of the parking area, there's a little trail that goes up into the woods. That's the old Appalachian Trail. There's no marker. There's no indication that is. But if you just follow that for about a quarter mile at the top of the ridge, and it's not an arduous climb, there's the only shelter that was built along that old section of the trail. The Civilian Conservation Corps built it in the 1930s. And because it was a CCC, they built it out of stone and cement. They're two main building materials. So it's still as solid as it was in 1937. And it's just a beautiful little shelter. And the views from there down into the Dan River Gorge are really spectacular. But I will say that shelter would not be allowed today because it's right at the edge of the cliff. So if you go out the front of the shelter, the first two steps are fine. And the third step is like 500 feet. And so, and the National Park Service for sure would not allow that on the Appalachian Trail today. So
not good for selfies, I don't think.
No, it's not a great selfie location.
All right, we're going to open it up. Do we have some questions out here? Yeah. The question is the old trail still being maintained by anybody?
So west of the New River, yes, because it's now the Iron Mountain Trail. And so from Bilsby Dam on the New River all the way to Damascus, you can hike on the Iron Mountain Trail. And that is the original route of the Appalachian Trail. And that's about 135 miles of trail. So that's the easy part. The rest of it, no.
Was the acquisition of private land ever an issue in this section or on the larger trail?
So in this section, no. And in fact, in the early days of the trail, almost all of when the trail was declared complete in 1937, only about 800 miles of the trail was on federal land. And the rest of it was on state land, private land. And on private land, it was done with easements. They would give you $1 a year for permission to route the trail across your property. And so that's what they did in Southwest Virginia is used easements. And that was never a problem. And in other parts of the trail, after the National Scenic Trails Act passed in 1968 and the Park Service started acquiring land, there were a couple of cases that were pretty contentious on eminent domain. The Carlisle Valley of Pennsylvania, probably the most contentious of those. But eminent domain was not used that much, less than I had expected.
Is the change better for hikers, better views, more beauty?
Well, having hiked or traversed both the old section of the trail and most of the newer section, I'm partial to the older section west of the New River. East of the New River, as I say, it was really the Blue Ridge Parkway obliterated a lot of the old trail, and I'm not into hiking along a parkway, so east of the river not so much, but west of the river, I prefer it. And the main reason is I generally hike by myself and I just like to be alone in the woods. And the Iron Mountain Trail is really underused. And it's just the views from there are great.
You don't get trampled by anybody else hiking either.
No.
Is there anything kind of follow up on that other question? You said there's no markers on this old trail. Is there any kind of movement, especially with your book, bringing the attention to the stories and the history to mark this?
So there is. It's complicated. Again, anything involving the Blue Ridge Parkway means the National Park Service, which means if you would like to put up a sign, then you have to work your way through many layers of bureaucracy, federal bureaucracy, in order to do that. And I did actually talk to somebody in the Park Service down in that part of the state, and she gave me all the forms for that little section I just told you about. I said, this is a perfect place to put up a sign saying the original route of the Appalachian Trail. And so she gave me the forms to fill out, and I still have the forms. I still haven't filled them out because it's a lot. But but there are groups in the area who are really interested in bringing this history back for tourism purposes or just because it's part of their story and they would like other people to know. I think it's important to realize that this is a part of the state where people's historical memories are very, very long. And they, they'll tell you about things that happened in 1790 as though it happened in 1950. And I'm serious about that. And, so one of the things I had to do when writing this book, I did a lot of work in the archives, but then I realized I just need to go and I need to just drive around and talk to people. And so that's what I did. And I met a lot of incredibly wonderful people by going into a diner and asking if anyone remembered the old trail. And Bob, who comes in here, his uncle used to work on the old trail. Well, what's Bob's last name? Bob, don't know. And but he comes in pretty regularly, so you could just hang out for a few days. But my favorite person of all is Ralph Barnard. I have a picture of Ralph and his lovely wife Hope in the book. And Ralph was the person. As I would talk to people would say to me, "Well, you need to talk to Ralph Barnard," and then they would say, "But Ralph is a little crusty or difficult or, just hard to talk to." And I don't know who they were talking about because I have found Ralph Barnard to be the sweetest, kindest, and most generous person I've met in years. So maybe he was just nice to me. I don't know. But it was kind of hard to get in touch with him because Ralph is in his 80s. And so I got his phone number from somebody, and I called, and he immediately hung up because, I was probably a telemarketer. And why wouldn't he think that? And so I called back and I said, Mr. Barnard, click. And so I realized I'm not going to get through to him on the phone. So I went old school and I wrote him a letter. It's really fun to show 20-year-olds letters. And so one of my kids was watching me. They're like, what are you doing? And I'm writing a letter. And what's a letter? And so I wrote Ralph, and he immediately wrote back and said, oh, I'd love to talk to you. Please call it. I won't hang up. And so I then went and hung out with Ralph and Hope, and I've been to visit them multiple times. And he drove me all around the Kibler Valley. And it's important to know when I talk about the long memories. So the Barnard family has been on that land since the end of the Revolutionary War, because their ancestor received that land as a land grant for service in Washington's army. So this is a part of the state where people have been in the same place for a very long time.
The New River crossing, I thought that was an interesting story as well. Is there any, I'm not aware of on the Appalachian Trail, any other rivers that are crossed? They were crossing on a ferry. Right.
The only place on the Appalachian Trail where you cross on a ferry is in Maine, and the Kennebec, you get canoed across basically. But other than that, there aren't any places where you have to take a boat to get across the river. And to get across the New River in the old section of the trail, it was the Dixon family who took you across. And so at Dixon's Ferry, you can drive down there now and see crossover on Dixon's Ferry Bridge, which wasn't there at the time. And the Dixon family also had been there since the Revolutionary War. And their family still owns one little piece of land on the river where they have family reunions and things like that. But for 5 cents, Mr. and Mrs. Dixon would put you across the river in this little flat-bottom boat, and they'd pull you across. And the New River is very wide, 50 yards or more. And so if you were coming south, you just went to the Dixon's house and you knocked on the door and you gave them 5 cents and they would put you across the river. If you were hiking north, you had to stand on the far shore and shout until somebody heard you and hope that someone was home, And so one of the people I interviewed for the book was Gene Espy, who also on the cover of the book. And Gene is 96. He hiked the entire trail in 1951. And so I interviewed him in 2019, when he was 92. And I asked him about it. And I said, so do you remember getting across the river there? And he said, oh, yeah, I remember that. And I said, how long did you have to shout before somebody came to get you? And he said, I don't know, but it was a long time. And I said, do you have any other memories about that? And he said, oh yeah, I remember that Mrs. Dixon came and got me, took me across, put me on the front porch for a few minutes and made me a lemonade or an iced tea or something like that. And we chatted and all about my hike. And he said, I was really glad to talk to somebody because he hadn't really had a chance to talk to many people since he started in Georgia. And he said, and there was this little girl just inside the screen door. And I tried to coax her to come out and talk to me, but she wouldn't. And so he finally gave up. Well, I interviewed that little girl, Sally, who's now in her late 70s. And I said, do you remember Mr. Espy? And she said, oh, sure, I remember Mr. Espy. When he finished his hike, he sent us a postcard from Maine, and we kept it on the refrigerator for years. And he used to send us Christmas cards. I mean, this is Gene Espy. He's that guy. And so I said to her, well, Sally, Gene told me that you wouldn't come out. Why wouldn't you come out? And she said, well, he had a beard. And if you go hiking on the Appalachian Trail today, any long-distance hiker, male long-distance hiker, has a beard. And so, because it's just inconvenient to shave. And I said, Sally, what was wrong with him having a beard? And she said, well, it was the 1950s, and my father had told me to stay away from men with beards. And I said, why? And she said, well, he told me they were either hobos or communists. So she was afraid Gene was one or the other.
What What came first, your love of history or your love of the trail, or how did they interplay?
So I think my love of history probably came first because I've just been a history nerd since I was a kid, But I started hiking when I was 12, and so I was probably already a history nerd at 12. So I think my love of history came first. But I did an entirely different kind of history in graduate school. If you look up my PhD from the 90s. My PhD is in modern East European history. I wrote a really great book on Czech politics in the 19th century, just in case you want to know more about that.
We don't have it over there.
No, I think it might be out of print. So I'm very proud of that work, but it's not, not, I would say, that engaging to a general audience. But in the mid 2000s, so like 2011, 2012, George Mason University, where I teach, had started a brand new program for undergraduates to do original research of their own, and not just like helping a faculty member, but doing their own research. And I had helped start that program, but students couldn't do that work with me because they didn't have any of the languages for my original specialty. So I thought, well, if I want to work with undergrads, which I did, I have to do something in English. And so I thought, well, I wonder if there are any things that I might do. And I started looking around, and then I thought, well, I like the Appalachian Trail. Maybe there's room for me to do something there. And sure enough, there weren't very many good histories of the AT. And so this was a great opportunity. And the archives of the Potomac Appalachian Trail Club are in Vienna, which is 25 minutes from our campus. And so students could go there and do research and things like that. So that's why I got started on this.
The question is about the Washington Post, the article they ran, and if it hit the spot and you were satisfied with it.
Yeah, that was Lizzie Johnson is the writer, and Lauren Tierney was the cartographer. And I worked really closely with both of them actually on that story, and I'm really happy with the way it came out. Lizzie is an absolutely fabulous writer. She published, I'll just plug something for her. She published a book called Paradise several years ago, and it's about the camp fire in California that burned the town of Paradise to the ground. Lizzie did over 500 interviews for that book, and it's really, really an amazing piece of work. And Lauren is a very, very talented digital cartographer. She made some really great maps for that story. So yeah, I was really happy with the way that came out.
What is your favorite story about the trail?
Well, that's a hard one. There are a lot of stories. Well, I think the one that I tell the most is because you mentioned Emma Gatewood or Grandma Gatewood, and everybody thinks that Emma Gatewood was the first woman to hike the whole Appalachian Trail. And she was, in fact, the third woman to do so. She was the first to do it by herself, but she was the third to do so. And a woman named Mary Kilpatrick did it in the 1930s as a section hiker with her husband and one of her husband's friends. And so she was the first woman to hike every step of the trail. And then, but my favorite is actually a woman named Mildred Norman, who hiked in this old section of the trail in 1952, the last year it was available. And she hiked with her boyfriend, Richard Lamb. Now, think about that for just a minute. Unmarried couple, 1952, very scandalous. And so they had a great system. Whenever they met somebody, he would step forward and say, "Hi, I'm Dick Lamb, and this is Millie." And just leave it there. Just let everyone assume that she was Millie Lamb, when in fact she was Millie Norman. And so they hiked all the way to Harrisburg. They got nervous that they might not make it to Maine before the snows came. So they took a bus to Baxter State Park, hiked up to the summit of Mount Katahdin, and then hiked back. But as they were hiking back, they came to the Long Trail in Vermont and thought, oh, well, that's a nice looking trail. And so they hiked up to the Canadian border, and then they couldn't get a ride back because it's the middle of nowhere north of Jay Peak on the Canadian border still. And so then they hiked back to the AT, and then they continued on back to Harrisburg. So they did the entire Appalachian Trail plus the northern half of the Long Trail twice. And but then Mildred, I don't really know what happened with her boyfriend, but he sort of vanishes from the story after this. She changed her name to Peace Pilgrim. and spent the rest of her life promoting nuclear disarmament, walking over 25,000 miles around the U.S. like a Buddhist monk, promoting nuclear disarmament. And so I see a few of you nodding like you recognize her. So it's just a great story. One of my students just finished her senior research project on Mildred. It's a great story.
The
Well,
question,
I think
what's your
mine-
trail name, right? And what
Yeah.
are the more interesting trail names you've heard?
So I think mine is actually the most interesting one. My trail name is Granddaddy Spartan. It's important to know you don't choose your trail name. Your trail name is chosen for you by others. And so I'm Granddaddy Spartan. And so, just how it happens.
Why? Story.
So when I hike for very long, I don't shave and I get a beard, and my beard comes in white since I was 40. And I was at a trail shelter in Shenandoah, actually, with one of my kids, and I'd been hiking for about a week. He just came out and joined me for the weekend, and there was an animated film called 300 about Sparta, and it had come out that year. And so Sparta was in people's minds. And I'd been hiking with a 16-year-old who's 6'5", and so he goes really fast. And I'm older. I didn't go that fast. I was really tired. And so we get to the shelter, and there are a bunch of thru hikers there. And I just wanted to go to bed, but I was, trying to stay awake. And one of the thru hikers looked at me. I was leaning against the shelter with my arms crossed, and one of the thru hikers looked at me and he said, "Dude, you look just like Granddaddy Spartan." And my son said he needed a trail name, and so. That's how it happened. So
there was a question earlier about where those trail names come from. It just can come out of just.
Yeah, it's supposed to be given to you by another hiker. And we don't really know when trail names began or why, but it's certainly in the 1970s because you start seeing it, every shelter along the trail has a logbook, and many of those logbooks have survived in the archives. And in the late 70s, you start seeing people using names like that for themselves. But it's not until the 90s that it becomes really common. I already have two, so it's Granddaddy Spartan. So to add a third one would be almost like a sentence. Yeah, no, I've already got one. So, and it's great because it's especially wonderful for women who are hiking alone on the trail, because it provides a level of anonymity that is just, one small layer of extra security. You don't have to say your full name, and you can if you want, but you can just say, I'm Moonbeam or whatever. And so my favorite trail name, though, was a woman I met down near the James River, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, and she was Pigpen, in Charlie Brown. And it was because she, early in her hike, she had slipped on a downslope in the mud, and it kind of rolled over several times and was just coated in mud. And one of the other hikers said, "Well, I know what your trail name is now." And so she was Pigpen. But there's some pretty colorful ones too. 100%. And so the Appalachian.
Can you repeat that question?
Oh yeah. So the question was, is the like getting up to be qualified as a thru hiker, is it honor system or not? And it is an honor system. In the earliest days of the hiking the whole trail, people were tested to see if they had actually done it. So it was in 1948, World War II vet named Earl Schaefer hiked from Georgia to Maine. It's still contested whether he qualifies as a thru hiker, because he definitely walked on some roads, took a couple of rides, but the trail was also in terrible shape in 1948. But he hiked from Georgia to Maine for sure, but nobody believed him. And because they said, well, that's like, why would anyone do that? That's just a stunt, And so he had to come to Washington, to the headquarters of the ATC, which was then in DC, and prove that he had actually hiked. And they were questioning me like, so when you were in, this state park, did you meet any of the park rangers? And if so, what were their names? And do you have photographs? Which he had a lot of photographs. So, but he said later it felt like a Gestapo interrogation. And so, but they did in fact agree that he had hiked from Georgia to Maine. And so for the first, I don't know, couple of decades, people did have to submit evidence that they had done it. But then the number of people attempting through hikes got to be so great that the volunteers at the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, they didn't have time to validate that. So in the early 70s, they just switched to honor system, and it's been honor system ever since.
What are those numbers now?
Oh, it's, between 1948, when Earl hiked from Georgia to Maine, and in the 1990s, it was under 500 people. And this year, I bet 3,000 people stepped off with an attempted through hike, maybe more than that. And so something like 85% of all the through hikes have been done in the last 20 years.
Did the pandemic affect those numbers any?
So during the pandemic, in an attempt to protect Appalachian rural communities from the virus, the Appalachian Trail Conservancy said, go home. We're not certifying through hikes this year. And there's a lot of anger about that, but I will say a lot of that anger came from people who have no concept of how difficult it is to get healthcare in rural Appalachian communities where you might have to drive 60, 70 miles to see a doctor. And so the idea that, you might bring, if you'll remember in the spring of 2020, we didn't know anything. And we didn't know how virulent the virus was and how deadly it was. And so the idea that because you have to go into town to resupply, and you just have to. And so there you might be exposing these rural communities to the virus. And so at a moment when we just really didn't know much, it was a safety measure. And so people did continue to hike. They just said, I don't care what you say, I'm going to hike no matter what, because you're not the boss of me. And so, but the numbers were much smaller in 2020 for sure.
The question is about trail angels, who they are. They're just there for you when you pass by and your slab of bacon.
Or they just give you more bacon, right? So resupply your bacon. But the idea that, people have been providing what today we call trail angel help since the beginnings of the trail. I have found in the PATC archives a really wonderful description of a hike from Harper's Ferry to Skyland in Shenandoah in 1934. And there were a couple of moments where these two young men experienced what today we would call a trail angel, but just people who help out. And sometimes it's completely coincidental. You're just driving up the road and you see somebody who looks like they really need a ride, and you give them a ride. I've done that several times, including driving one young man into the emergency room in Waynesboro because he had trench foot. You don't want to see that, trust me. But there are also people who just do it now. Like they just like to help the hikers. And so, for instance, this summer, was a really dry summer in a lot of the East Coast. And so a lot of the springs along the trail ran dry. And so there were people who were just putting out 20, 30 gallon milk jugs of water at road crossings for hikers. So it ranges from everything from, giving people rides to helping them with water.
So what's next for you on this? Your response on the book. I know you're heading to Roanoke right after this, so you've been chatting with lots of folks.
Yeah. So I've been doing a lot of programs like this, and a lot of presentations all up and down the kind of central portion of the Appalachian Trail. I'm going to be at the annual meeting of the Roanoke Club this evening, and now I'm working on a new book, and about the person who may just be the first person to hike every step of the trail. His name was Eiler Larson. Anybody from Laguna Beach? Okay, because if you were, I was going to talk to you about him. Because Larson was a Danish immigrant, came to the United States in 1916, became a U.S. citizen so he could fight in the First World War, because Danes didn't really like Germans in those days. And then he was a veteran, came back to the U.S., and in 1930 embarked on a hike from Mount Katahdin to Mount Oglethorpe. It took him 8 years to do that because he had this habit of stopping in places for a year or two, including he was in D.C. for a couple of years. And then he went on to ultimately to live in California and spent the last 30 years of his life in Laguna Beach, which Laguna, it's like a magnet for oddballs and artists. And Timothy Leary, who many of you will remember hearing about, he did all of his LSD experimentation in Laguna Beach. The skateboard was invented in Laguna Beach, the modern version of the skateboard. Lots of interesting things. But Larson, he became the official greeter of Laguna, because since the 1920s, he had had the habit of standing on street corners in cities, as he would hike south, and then eventually in California, he would stand on street corners and shout at people, "Hello, it's a beautiful day. Isn't nature wonderful?" He had this whole philosophy of beauty and nature and happiness, and he was like a street corner preacher, but not for religion, but for nature and the natural world. And he was 6'5", had long hair and a beard in the 1930s, when, remember, only hobos or communists had those hair choices. And he was incredibly loud, and people thought he was crazy. And then they would go talk to him and find out, no, actually he speaks 5 languages fluently. He's very well read in German philosophy and Buddhist religion, and is actually a really interesting guy. And he just wanted everyone to be happy.
Wow. We'll look forward to that book too then. I want to, we are definitely out of time here, but I want to thank everyone for coming out today. I keep saying tonight because I'm used to that. I want to thank the Winchester Brew Works again, Gaines Group. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all for being here.